On December 23, 1913, Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in a near-empty Capitol building during the final hours before Christmas recess. The bill had been debated for months and passed with a margin so narrow that the absence of just a few representatives would have killed it. The language of the act granted a private consortium of banks the authority to issue United States currency, manage its supply, and set the terms under which the government itself could borrow. This was presented as modern economic management, but the timing was not unique to America. Between 1694 and 1913, every major central bank on Earth appeared within a 219-year corridor. The Bank of England in 1694, the Banque de France in 1800, Germany's Reichsbank in 1876, the Bank of Japan in 1882, and finally the Federal Reserve in 1913. These institutions did not emerge slowly across millennia of trade. They appeared in synchronized waves across different continents and political systems using the same structural blueprint. This synchronization coincides with a specific historical window, the moment when the last maps of the pre-modern world stopped circulating and old cartographic guilds were dissolved. It was a time when land surveys were being redrawn under new property laws, and territorial claims that had existed for centuries were legally nullified. The question is why these banks all appeared at the same moment in history using identical legal language during the final transformation of the Earth's surface into something measurable, divisible, and collateralized. The official narrative claims central banks evolved naturally as economies modernized, framing them as responses to crisis rather than causes. However, the actual charters tell a different story. The Bank of England's 1694 charter introduced the phrase perpetual succession, a term previously unknown in English corporate law. This was not a business managing deposits, it was a private institution granted permanent legal existence and the exclusive right to create currency. Within 5 years, the bank held more sovereign debt than the entire GDP of the nation. This model was not a slow evolution, but a replicated installation. The Banque de France, the Reichsbank, and the Bank of Japan all adopted this exact legal architecture despite having no prior shared banking traditions. These were not independent inventions, they were installations of the same financial operating system. None of these institutions were designed by elected legislators. They were designed by private financial interests and then submitted to governments for ratification. William Paterson, a financier behind a failed colonial scheme, drafted the Bank of England's charter. The Banque de France was structured by private creditors after a currency collapse. The Federal Reserve was famously drafted in secret at Jekyll Island by a small group of bankers and a senator traveling under assumed names to avoid public scrutiny. The language of these bills did not come from the state, it came from the creditor class. Every major central bank establishment coincides with a wave of land survey modernization. In England, the bank followed the Enclosure Acts, which converted common land into private property, displacing millions of families. In France, the bank appeared during the Napoleonic cadastral survey, which turned land into a taxable commodity. Japan's bank arrived during the Meiji land tax reform, which abolished feudal holdings and forced farmers to pay taxes in cash. In the United States, the Federal Reserve was signed as the frontier closed and the Dawes Act broke up collective indigenous land holdings into individual private plots. Collective land became private property became taxable, and taxable land became collateral that could back a currency. The pattern suggests that central banks emerged not to manage complexity, but to monetize formalized property. Once land was redefined as a fungible asset class, the Earth's surface was transformed into a balance sheet. This transformation was engineered, requiring the destruction of prior systems like common fields or feudal customs. The central banks did not just manage this change, they converted formalized land into debt instruments. By 1913, the globe was surveyed, enclosed, and banked. Following this, the world entered its most financially destructive period, including 2 world wars and the Great Depression. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference did not dismantle this model, it globalized it. While the official goal was post-war stability, the structural effect was to lock the central bank model into a global framework. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created, functioning as a franchise expansion. To receive reconstruction aid, nations had to establish central banks using the Western template and formalize property laws recognizable to creditors. By 1960, nearly every newly independent nation in Africa and Asia had established a central bank because access to international credit required it. Under the law, central banks are not traditional government agencies. The Federal Reserve is a private consortium that operates with statutory independence and has never been fully audited. The European Central Bank operates under treaty law that prevents elected governments from altering its mandate. These institutions hold legal privileges immune from public accountability, and the records explaining their original designs are often missing, restricted, or sealed. Before this era, national debt was not permanent. After the arrival of central banks, debt became a structural feature. In 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was established, the U.S. ratified the 16th Amendment for income tax. A bank that issues currency as debt requires a guaranteed repayment mechanism, taxation. This changed the relationship between the individual and the state, as citizens became guarantors of a debt they never voted for. Today, the system is total. Every dollar in circulation is borrowed into existence, carrying interest that must be paid back. Since only the principal is created, the system requires perpetual growth and new loans to cover the interest on the old ones. This is not a flaw, it is the design. Every attempt to operate outside this framework, such as proposals for gold-backed currencies in Libya or Iraq, has been met with immediate consequence. The official story calls this progress, but the charter language calls it perpetual succession. These institutions were installed to replace the sovereignty of governments with the sovereignty of creditors. They are the most successful mechanism ever designed to convert the surface of the earth and every human born onto it into a revenue stream that flows in one direction, upward, forever.